Hey everyone, welcome back to Athena's Wellness Wisdom. For this podcast today, I have a good friend of mine, Shelby Dennis from Milestone Equestrian. And I'm going to start out by just reading her blog from kind of like her introduction of herself from her newest book, Secrets of Horses.
Secrets of the Horse.
Shelby Dennis is an acclaimed professional horse trainer, equine advocate, International Association of Animal Behavior Consultant, certified equine behavioral consultant, and co-founding member of the Alliance of Horse Welfare and Sport. A driving force in the equestrian world, she is known for her compassionate approach to horse training and her unwavering commitment to the well-being of horses. With a lifetime of experience in the saddle and deep understanding of equine behavior, Shelby has dedicated her career to revolutionizing traditional training methods and promoting a more empathetic and respectful relationship between horses and humans. Hi, Shelby.
Hello, thanks
Welcome.
so much for having me on. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah. So first, I'd kind of like to say how Shelby and I got to know each other. It was actually, I'd say, like close to 10 years ago now.
Yeah, it's
We
crazy how
both
long that's been.
exactly. We were both working at a racehorse farm, and we were both just exercising the horses there. And yeah, that was Shelby's first like galloping job, and I'd been galloping for a while already, and I was just like so blown away by your ability just to be, to ride these horses, and your confidence riding horses. And and then also you started kind of at that point in your life, you're really advocating thoroughbreds and just their ability, and you're just like such a strong voice for advocating of thoroughbreds at that time. And so I really respected that and your writings and stuff on the topic. But that was 10 years ago. And so it's really interesting how both of us have changed like so much in that time. Just kind of the way we view the horse world, especially like racehorses specifically. Um, and neither of us are involved in racehorses anymore. And yeah, it's just maybe we could talk a little bit about the changes of where we were then to where we are.
Yeah. Yeah, like the first thing I'll say is like I have a lot of appreciation for the experience that I gained while working at the racetrack, especially working with Terry, who we both worked for. I think that being able to work for someone like her was a really good thing because I would have had a much more negative perspective on racing. Otherwise, she set an example in comparison to my other experiences in the racing industry and what I've come to see as normal just from looking at how other people do things. That was a lot more positive for the horses. And I also definitely noticed that with her horses, they had less stall vices. They were typically easier to handle. They looked better. And there was a lot of great things there. I also did find that she's much more open-minded than a lot of people in the racing industry and was more progressively thinking already. And I think that's a really great thing. So I had a lot of appreciation for her because still to this day, like she's the best, most respectful employer I have ever had in the horse world. Like she treated her employees really, really well. And regardless of what part of the horse industry you're working in, whether it's racing or somewhere else, the way she treated her employees was above and beyond and unusual. Like, I remember she would do things like just giving us bonuses and raises without ever having to ask. I never had to ask her for a raise because she would just give them, and you just look at your paycheck and it would be there. And there's just a lot more respect and understanding. So I have a lot of appreciation for the industry. However, there's been things that as time has gone on that I really can't ignore because there's some very obvious trends, and one of those things is with the amount of vet checks that I was present for horses that were being sold off the racetrack. There's very clear trends in the types of injuries they would have, the wear and tear on their bodies, and things that you can't really look away from and make excuses for because it was honestly more unusual than not to see horses that pass with really clean x-rays when they're getting their sales vet checks. Most of them had like bone chips or like early onset arthritis or like mild to moderate kissing spine. And it's also keeping in mind that people who are vet checking them aren't necessarily doing full x-rays. It's just the parts they are choosing to x-ray. And That has shifted my perspective on how I approach horse training. I also think that generally speaking, the expectations that are placed on young horses, regardless of the discipline, are very, very unfair. And if you were to expect the same from people who are starting exercising and trying to get fit, you'd be the world's worst personal trainer if you took someone and within 30 days, you want them to go from doing nothing to doing all sorts of different activities while packing 10% or more of their body weight. So, something I like to stress is that I criticize the racing industry a lot more now, and I'm much more critical, but I do still have appreciation for what I learned in it, and I also understand, like, the people within it are just people. Like, I don't like how much they are vilified and viewed as, like, people who are acting intentionally malicious, because that's not the case.
Yeah, that's a good point. We're super fortunate to work with Terry, and Terry is super fortunate to have her farm as a training facility, and that is definitely like a huge factor. The horses were turned out after we rode them, and if they didn't get ridden that day, they got some turnout time, the paddocks and stuff. Whereas unfortunately at the racetrack, they're not. They're stalled like in BC anyways, or majority of when you're at the actual racetrack setting, they're stalled at like 2.5 hours a day, basically. So that's definitely a very valid point. And so I know that you, from the farm, you wanted to go to the racetrack. I feel like I was definitely one of like people that encouraged you to come to the racetrack because we were short on like quality exercise riders. So it's kind of like, here, Shelly, come on, like, and I'd help you get on some horses and stuff, and like, and even like at the time, and I knew at the time it was horses that I couldn't get on due to my like level of fitness and just ability versus, I was like, oh, Shelly's pretty good sticky rider. Like you're probably gonna be okay with this one and stuff like that. And then yeah, so like you said, it's just that eye opening difference of the racetrack scene versus the farms. And also like I've been very fortunate to worked in Australia with racehorses, and it's like a
Yeah,
whole
I'd
different
love
ball
to go
game.
there just to see, because yeah, Australia and then also in Europe more so, they bring them like, they travel to the racetrack to race, and otherwise they're training at home, and I do think that that plays a big difference, because like, the energy even with the people at the racetrack versus the farm, it felt like going back to high school in a lot of ways with the drama and, like, how angsty and frustrated the people were and just how much gossip and talking there was, and it was, like, not the it was a pretty toxic work environment, if I'm being completely honest, and then obviously the horses are much more stressed, because Hastings in particular, like, this part's not the people's fault who kept their horses there, but it's the fault of the managing organization that ran that place. It was, like a slum in the back, like, they didn't update the stalls or repair anything for decades and decades, and the stalls were all, like, 10 by 10, so they're, like, very small even for stalls, and just dilapidated and terrible, and it's just not a good place for horses to be. Like, the sad thing about that racetrack is that Vancouver is such a beautiful city, and, like, they could have done more to make it better for the horses and to also make it better for the people, and all of the energy and effort was just put into the casino. So there were certain aspects that for the people who were there, it's completely out of their control, and they're just at the mercy of the people in control deciding, and I empathize with that, and I think that also causes a lot of the frustration that we see in the people and maybe some of the toxicity as well.
Yeah, I think this is a good way to lead into like, um, I know in your book you talk about like horses as a mirror, and just there's so many of those people at the racetrack that literally they live there as well, and their homes were these tack rooms that were even smaller than horse stalls, and that's where they were expected just to live there and stay there. That's all they could afford themselves. It was kind of terrible. So yeah, it's just kind of. You mind talking a bit about how like this concept of horses is being a mirror to people, and maybe like um, their internal, emotions and behaviors kind of mirror.
For sure. I think in environments like the racetrack, when the horses aren't getting turned out and they're having so many abnormal stress behaviors, they end up becoming really dangerous to handle. And I think whether people are ready to admit it or not, a lot of their frustration comes out of fear because you're basically just being perpetually endangered and you always have to be on edge and you're having to manhandle these horses and be harsh with them. And you're placed in situations where you don't really have solutions because you can't fix what's causing their problems if it's related to the fact that they're just kept in a 10 by 10 box all the time. So it's all Band-Aid fixes. It's like throw a lip chain on them, get after them, like spank them with the whip, do this, do that. And you're basically just in the midst of this terrible situation where you're having to deal with all of the backlash from the horses being unhappy and you're having your body injured and yourself endangered because of it. And in order to cope with that, I think a lot of people can't be as empathetic because if you look at it through the standpoint of this horse is really struggling, they're not getting enough turnout, you can't really survive that environment, so you have to try to make excuses for it because it otherwise it would feel terrible slapping a gum chain on a horse that's like a 2 and 3-year-old horse and is kept in a tiny little closet for its whole day other than the 15 minutes that it's out on the racetrack. And I think that in time, like, that really makes people become calloused and frustrated because even when you're in denial and you're trying to make excuses for what's happening, internally, like, you know that something's not right, and I do think that most of the people that are handling horses do love horses in their own way, but there's this opposition between how they feel about horses deep down and what they're having to do to maintain those jobs and do what needs to be done in the industry, and since the industry isn't changing and there feels like there's very little options, then you're just put in like, you're put between a rock and a hard place where really your only option is to quit and get a different job if you wanna actually act within your morals, or you have to try to make excuses and do the best you can in that situation, and it's not a good place, so I think that when horses are stressed, frustrated, and chronically deprived of needs, the people mirror that in the sense that they're also stressed, frustrated, they're often being endangered, and they're having to act outside of what their morals would actually want to be doing in order to survive the environment, and that's something that I found with myself. When I was working at the racetrack, I was much less patient. I was much more frustrated because I was exhausted. I was getting up at, like, 4 AM every day to get to the racetrack and be on my first horse by 6 AM, and then I was riding, like, 15 horses from, like, 6 AM to 10 AM or so, and then having to drive home from Vancouver and then go get on more horses for, like, my training business, and it was way too much physical labor to put my body through, and I for sure injured myself, and I'm probably gonna have lasting impacts that are gonna just become more and more apparent as I age, and since I was so overworked, overwhelmed, and also placed in situations where I just had to do what I could within a situation I largely couldn't control, it made me very frustrated and impatient, and I was not as good of a horse person because I wasn't responding from a regulated place, and I think that's what a lot of people in the horse industry experience.
Yeah, so I'm hearing is just people who get themselves, in these situations where maybe danger is a factor. Fear comes out, overworked, overtired, and potentially injuring yourself. Like all these factors build up that even in just this one work environment, it kind of blankets out to the rest of your life in your other work environments. And just thinking like it's also not just the racetrack. Like stressful show environments, I'm sure are similar. Just this time constraint on and this like competitive nature. Have to do this, have to get this done. So yeah, it's not just horse racing; it's all of the horse industry. I feel like has similar
100%,
issues.
and we create these environments where it's like you have no other choice because basically it's like if the horse needs to race and the everyone who's actually making the decisions for the horse is saying that, it ultimately doesn't really matter what you feel as the exercise rider or the groom, and you can know in your heart that something's wrong or that this shouldn't be happening or that the horse needs more time or that they need more patience, but if people are pushing you to do things, then you have to do that or you have to quit. And, like, what the where I found myself at the racetrack is that I was looking around and I was seeing what other people were doing to the horses, and a lot of people at the track were way more rough on the horses than I was. And this isn't to say like I was doing everything right, because I was still stressing them out. I was still doing stuff that wasn't in their best interest, but I wasn't one of the people who was losing my patience and absolutely beating the shit out of them on the track. So when I would get a sensitive horse that was more of a struggle, I would look around and I would go, well, if I don't work with this horse, someone worse is very likely to get on this horse and give them a much worse time. And then that's a hard mindset to be in, because you are in a way engaging in harm reduction, but also I don't think it's a healthy situation to stay in, especially long term, because you're having to sacrifice your own integrity to maintain that career choice.
Yeah, definitely. So I'm just wondering, like, where did the change come for you? I know you do discuss it a bit in your book, but was it the education you got from doing your equine behavior studies that started, or kind of just like a knowing that you had to search for other answers, or where? How did that shift come about for you?
I think it was a bunch of different things, because it started off, like, even before I started working at the racetrack, I was starting to see shifts in my horsemanship when I got my horse Milo, and I was met with the reality that high pressure, really forceful methods don't work on all horses, because he was ready to fight me on things, and I had to start developing more patience. I still used force, and I still wasn't as kind and patient with him as I should have been for a lot of years, but it pushed me to be curious and to start to question what I'd been taught, because it exposed a lot of holes in what I'd been taught and showed me that it wasn't as effective as what trainers had taught me. And then I started pursuing a post-secondary education in equine sciences. And initially, my first few courses were about exercise physiology, so like the anatomy and the musculature of the horse and how we get them fit and how we train them. And a lot of stuff that I learned in that made me question the entire fabric of the industry and how it's set up. But in a way where it's like, okay, like, this is how I can work with horses within the confines of the competitive industry to be successful, to try to be as ethical as possible, but my goal was still very much being successful in the competitive realm. Um, so I still pushed Milo very, very hard, and he showed me a lot with his behavior that he wasn't okay with what was going on. And then the more that I studied behavior, especially like human psychology as well, because I did some psych classes in post-secondary that were for human psych, and there's so much crossover between how mammals think and feel that it started to become really obvious. And then I started to connect things that I felt about the world to how horses might feel and vice versa. And then I started to learn about rewards-based training, and the more that I used it, the more I realized how much value it has. And then it kind of started to compound and like pile up, where it's like now there's a lot of conflict between the goals that I thought I had with the competitive world and the new ethical background that I am developing. And now these things are in opposition. So for a while, I was kind of in this weird state where I was trying to fight to maintain the goals that I had set at a time in my life where I wasn't looking at things from a behavior informed perspective and what I had thought for so many years that I wanted, because it was what was validated by everyone around me. And it was what was taught to me as like one of the primary career choices if you want to work with horses and how to be successful. The entire idea of success in the industry is largely grounded in this idea of being successful in competition or producing horses for competition. And as I was building myself as a trainer and developing that career, that's what got me the most attention, especially being able to stay on and ride horses who are freaking out. And a lot of my value system for myself as a rider surrounded that, because like I do have a good seat. I can stay on and like I can balance and I can ride them through stuff, and I didn't fall off very often. And it's like that's true, but it's like why was I putting myself in those situations in the first place? It's just so unnecessary safety wise and also unfair to the horse. So then eventually that conflict started to pile up to the point where I really had to start to reflect and look at what my goals were, how I was showing up in the horse industry. And then I started to take a pretty hard pivot, because I was realizing how bad my mental health was when I was doing stuff within the traditional horse industry and chasing these goals that I had set when I was young and did not know what I know now. And it was a bit of an ego death, because so much of my value system for myself as a person and my identity was structured around who I was as a horse person. So it was a really and honestly, I'm still going through it to some extent, because I'm also redefining defining how I show up as a trainer and how I wanna run my training business, because another thing that I've found, even when you're pursuing things more ethically, when you're at the mercy of what your clients want you to do with your horses, you're financially stressed. If you set a boundary that your client's like, "Fine, I'll just go find a trainer that will do this for me then." And then it's like now if that's the client that's been paying you the most, now you're suddenly impacted in how you can pay rent and afford to live. And realizing that too, it's like I don't wanna continue being within a system where my ethics are in opposition to my ability to make a living and get paid and be able to afford to live. So it's been a lot of different little things that have added up, and then restructuring as I've learned, because I've already restructured my training business, but I'm kind of doing it again because when you're taking in clients for full training, they either need to be very on the same page as you. And even when people start out saying that, I've had issues with people being like, "Oh, take your time, just do what the horse needs." And then it changes as soon as they start seeing improvement, where now suddenly they want you to move faster and they want you to do things that aren't necessarily in alignment with what the horse can do. And then when you push back against that as a trainer, you can get fired because there's always going to be someone who will push the horse harder. So it's a disadvantage to be more ethical, because you can always find people that are willing to say the right things to justify not considering the horse.
Yeah, like frustrating when you're just trying to do the right thing, and like you said, there's conflict between, making a living and keeping your clients and wanting to do the right thing by your own ethical standards and the horse.
Yeah,
But what you were saying right now, I'd really love to read out one quote that I wrote down from your book. You do talk a lot in the beginning of your book about this like shift in perspective that you've had. So I'm just going to read out one really powerful quote that I wrote down. It says, I am a whole human outside my belief systems, and changing my beliefs when faced with new information is not a threat to my identity. It is a chance to grow. And yeah, you're just talking now about that ever evolving, ever changing, growth. Like, to be people, we that's kind of the goal in life is to keep changing and to keep growing. So many people say that, oh, people don't change. But in my opinion, it's that's the goal of life is to be able to change and to be able to grow. And yeah, just in those 10 years from where we both were before, and yeah, like I same as you said, you valued and I valued, like, wow, look at this girl, like this horse is going like crazy. She did 8 seconds plus, and like, we valued that as so cool. But now you look at it a different way, and same as you, I'm like, well, why was the horse doing that? Like, that's not a cool thing. That just shows you how stressed the horse actually is, right? It was just this whole different perspective
for
on
sure.
life. Yeah,
Yeah,
and just
it's hard too, because I find that, like, part of the thing is, like, when you're seeking validation from other people whose entire means of valuing people, is in opposition to what your new value system becomes. It's still hard because you kind of want to seek the approval of people. And I found that I've done all these things. I've galloped racehorses and I've done the work that a lot of the people who now criticize me the most would have respected back then. But all of what I've done in the past is completely invalidated now because I no longer stand for that. And that's been something that's also been hard to navigate, because my experience in the past isn't canceled out because I've recognized the flaws in that system and I've decided to do things differently. It was still experience because it taught me what I don't want to continue doing. And now that I'm not perpetually stressing horses out and having these big explosives to show off to people, there's this assumption that it's like I can't handle them. And it's not that. It's that I don't want to create those situations because that's a sign that I've screwed up.
yeah, exactly. And so, you said you took some psychology courses. So the path that I'm going down now, and I've actually just started like a full-time program for professional counseling. It's a 1-year program. So, and I did some psychology-based courses before that to get into this program. And so I'm just wondering if you wanted to talk a little bit, like I know in your book you kind of describe the fact that horses are fight and flight animals, and just a little bit about like people, you know, you talk a little bit about societal pressures, other people's, um, like the way they view you and stuff. Just wondering, like you kind of mentioned in your book, you talked to it a little bit about how like being a fight and flight animal kind of is similar almost to a person in, you know, PTSD. Like when people get super stressed in our nervous systems, like the way society is right now, it seems like we're always kind of on edge. We're always looking for this outside validation. And it's kind of like maybe another way that horses mirror us and kind of that stress response. Just maybe talk a little bit about like horses and people just and stress, if that makes sense.
For sure. So a lot of the situations that people view that like as necessitating using high levels of force are created because the horse is stressed. And I find that in the horse industry, there's this fixation on handling the behavior as it occurs in the moment rather than looking at why it's occurring. And then people put themselves and the horses in these increased dangerous situations when it's not necessary. This fixation on trying to address the symptoms of a problem as they're already happening, like by getting a harsher bit or putting like a lip chain on, etc. Those things are only helpful as the behavior is already occurring, and if the issue is trying to create safety and avoid those things, then you need to look at the nervous system and why the horse is reacting that way. And a lot of it comes down to the environment and it just putting the horse in a perpetual state of stress, which for people who've experienced trauma, when your body is constantly on edge, like you will jump at sounds that you would typically be able to tune out and you'll be more flighty and anxious because your body is constantly looking for threats. And the same thing can be said about horses. When we've given them a reason to be in this heightened state of stress all the time, it's going to take a lot less to set them off. And you can lower that stress response by meeting those needs and creating safety in the environment. And I think that's one of the things that a lot of horse training is missing is that the horses don't feel safe because the person that should be a source of safety for them oftentimes is the primary source of stress. And then when a bunch of stuff starts happening in the environment that the human can't always control, you lose out on the benefit of being a safe place for the horse because if the horse learns that you protect them and that they can feel safe around you, and that you're not going to make the situation worse for them, they can look to you for guidance in those moments that are out of your control. But unfortunately, a lot of training views behavior through this lens of being good or bad and wanting to punish unwanted behaviors. And it's the equivalent of if you had a friend who's having a panic attack and you just were to yell at them and shake them or hit them or something, it's not going to stop them from having a panic attack. It's not going to make them feel safe. You might eventually succeed in suppressing the outward response of their panic, but you're not actually making them feel safe. And that is the issue that we see in a lot of horse training, where it's about suppressing the outward response rather than actually dealing with what is inwardly causing that response.
Yeah, so another thing to mention here for people and horses is like this idea of trigger stacking. Um, so like maybe a horse can maybe you're going down the trail and a rabbit runs out and the horse spooks once and you know the rabbit's gone, but maybe the horse never actually lets go of that rabbit. He just kind of remembers it in the back of your head. And you're going a little bit further and you know and a loud noise happens over there and that's another little trigger. And all these triggers just kind of keep stacking up and if the horse never really lets go and feels and gets that release of all of these things that happen and if you don't deal with it, you know, in a calm way, or just yeah, find a way for the horse to get some release from it, and you just kind of keep going. Well, maybe you know the 12th rabbit will pop its head out, and that will cause this huge runoff, spook, wheel, buck sort of thing. And you think, well, it was just a rabbit. He didn't care about the last couple rabbits, but it's the fact that all these triggers stack up. So, like, I know you talk a lot about like housing management with our horses and you know just like taking away all these little bits of things that they need or just these little triggers that stack on top of each other and if you don't address them and you know give the horse their freedom and of what they truly need to be like farm safety like you're talking about, then all these things stack up and the same's true for people. Like people can get trigger stacked too with
Mhm.
all these different things happening and then you know your kid just says mommy 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 too many times and you yell and freak out at them as if you know but it's just all these triggers stacking on top of each other and it's just like that's something that you know I really want our listeners to realize that this happens for our horses and this happens for us as well.
For sure. Like I actually have a good example of trigger stacking from the racetrack that I witnessed, and it was a situation where I was just there to spectate, like I wasn't there to train or handle any of the horses, and I didn't want to step any toes, but I saw it coming for a while, a long time. Like they had and you actually know the horse. I forget his name is escaping me right. Oh, Sam. It was Sam. He was getting ready to go pony for the races and they had him tied to one of the out of the stalls, the bars of the stalls in the aisleway, and he was hard tied, which will be important later. And they had this oscillating fan. This was after like he wasn't being used by Terry anymore and had moved to a different barn. And Sam was a pretty nervous horse and more sensitive. But they had an oscillating fan, and I was watching him as they tacked him. Every time the fan came by and hit him, I could see him tense up, and his head was just getting higher and higher. And then at one point, someone decided to unplug the fan and move it, and they were moving it, and the leg of the fan just brushed his hind leg as they were walking past him. And as soon as it did that, he exploded. He set back and started freaking out until he broke his halter that he was wearing. And everyone that watched this happen, other than me, was like, wow, that came out of nowhere. He reacted out of nowhere. And it's like, no, he didn't. His body was holding so much tension, and there was all these smaller behaviors that show that he's not relaxed, like his posture, where his head is, how tense his muscles are, and then finally that last little thing of being touched by the fan as they came by set him off because he wasn't really coping well. And it's situations like that where if people are more in tune with how their horse is actually feeling and don't wait to see these really big outward signs of anxiety, you can help reduce the response. And then also just not suppressing the anxious behaviors in the first place, because when we punish horses for how they behave when they're stressed instead of helping them learn how to regulate properly, then we're basically taking the batteries out of a smoke alarm and you're taking away the warning signals.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. And so like I talk a lot on my podcast about just awareness. And so for me, that just means, just like really for each individual person working on just cultivating that awareness. So if it is with like training horses, just having that awareness of these little things, just trying to practice looking at the whole situation and what's happening. And the same thing, you can have this awareness within yourself, even during training and stuff, on just like, how is this making me feel? Like when my horse does, reach back and, maybe like throw his head when I'm trying to do something, like how does that making me feel? And what and like how is that making the horse feel? Just like I just find so important to have just try to cultivate this sense of awareness. And then another thing,
Absolutely.
when you're talking about horses, for me now that I'm, a mother, my daughter's 3 now, and it's just so many things I found with horses and with my training of horses. I've had horses my entire life. Vinny's 21 now, and I've known him since he was 2 and called him mine since he was 4. And I just kind of laugh because I feel like good thing I didn't have a kid that many years ago because like Vinny has so many different the training and the awareness and the stuff that happened throughout all that time before I grew my own awareness, it's like my daughter's so much more I can be so much more attuned to her just because I grew so much as an individual before having her and I just take it to awareness. And it's just so many things about having a child and having an animal. I just I see so much similarities in it. But
Oh,
I
for
guess when you think
sure.
about it on like the psychological level, like horses are mammals, we're mammals. That's why we have so many similarities. But as humans, we have that huge part of our brain, the cortex, that's for all these higher memory, thinking, complex behaviors, and everything. But children don't have that yet. So children are literally the same as animals, when you're going through and even some of the things we talked about today already. I just can't help but think back to having, children and training children and training animals.
I think about
And
that
I
a
just
lot. Even though, like, I don't have kids, just because I look at these adults who have no emotional regulation skills, and I'm like, I'm certain that your parents didn't set you up for success, and their parents also probably didn't. So I think that's what we see in the horse world is all of these unhealed people who have never had their loved ones hold space for them properly when they're stressed, anxious, frustrated, and they're perpetually suppressing their emotions, and then they go on to do that to all of the animals and the vulnerable creatures and peoples that they work with because they've never had that taught to them, and I think that kids are the future, is, like, teaching children to emotionally regulate and holding space for them is gonna heal everybody.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm wondering, do you work with like when you work with horses, do you have you started working with the people as well, or do you focus just on the horses?
I work with the people more now, and I wanna start doing it more, like, I think for me, what I like, my goal for the future is to set up a situation where I can train out of my own facility, where I'm more in control of all the different moving parts of that facility, like how the horses live, how we structure the day-to-day, like feeding schedules, etcetera, and actually being able to set it up and build it in the way that I'd want to, which is really limiting when you're renting. So it's something where I'm going to need to try to get to the point where I can buy properties so that I can really pull it off. And then I'd want to be able to invite people in, like what, so that if you don't have your own horse, you could come for the day to work there. And work with horses there and just learn about behavior that way. But I do a lot of like online webinars and education and behavioral consults where I'm helping the people and doing less direct work with the horses, and I prefer that because I find when people are sending horses in for like full training, for example, especially the way that I used to do it, the owner's really removed from the horse's day to day and they kind of just want to show up and get the horse when the horse is fixed, but then they have none of the skills to actually continue the training because they haven't been actively involved in the training. And then there often is regression because the horse isn't being handled the same way that it would have been when the behavioral problems were being fixed. Um, and I found the same thing too with like training and selling horses, where if you buy a horse from someone who has had it out 24/7 in a herd, and then you go and put that horse in a small paddock or a stall most of the time, it's completely unreasonable to expect the horse to be the same. But then we see this happening a lot in the industry, and people will be like, "Oh, someone lied to me and they sold me a horse that wasn't what the horse I tried." And it's like, some of the cases there are people who lie because there's a lot of very dishonest sellers, so it absolutely can be true. But just as often, I think, people disrupt the care practices of the horse and put them in situations that change their behavior, and then they try to blame people.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. For a horse, that just goes to show you how much environment really matters with these animals. Um, and I know you have other animals too. It's not just horses. So I'm wondering if we can talk a little bit about. Um, I know, like in some of your videos and stuff, you talk about how horse animals can be seen as like the companion. Like animals are great listeners, they're non-judgmental, and that sort of thing. But then in your book, I know you talk a little bit and you tell, you know, very honestly, and it's very powerful when I was reading it about how your journey with horses and due to some of your developmental trauma growing up and just the way that you kind of your training of this horse and making it do the things when you were younger, was kind of like a sense of control in your life. So maybe just talking a little bit about like the difference, like that the different ways animals can be in our life, and just maybe what you found about like that companion side of thing, which I know lots of people maybe understand and think about, but maybe people don't have this awareness of just how you described as like horses especially, or maybe dogs, like animals that you train and you kind of control.
So I do think that a lot of what we see where people are being really forceful in training, it often stems from people not having much control over their lives, where you feel forced to go to work and oftentimes at jobs that you don't like and work certain numbers of hours just to be able to afford a living. A lot of people don't really have that much time to engage in hobbies that they enjoy and do stuff that actually fills up their cup. So they're feeling perpetually depleted. And then you get this opportunity, especially with animals, but people also do this with children. It's just a little less accepted, but it still happens a lot, where you can essentially dictate and control their entire life and set up everything. And exercise a level of control that they often don't have over their own lives, and I think that that gives people feelings of power that is very reinforcing, and in a lot of animal training, it becomes about making what we can make animals do rather than how they feel while doing it and what is actually driving that response because there's a lot of fixation on success in training being all about what horses can do and what they can do to perform for us and that being the pinnacle of it, even when it's achieved with brute force and these horses are in distress while they're performing these things for people. And that's something that's shifted as I've gotten older where to me, training isn't successful if the animal that you're working with is under duress the entire time. Like if they stress isn't 100% avoidable in life, we'll all experience stress, but if they're in a high state of stress and sustained state of stress most of the time they're training, it doesn't matter how many skills they have if that's how they're emotionally feeling, because that's not healthy or sustainable or fair. So with working with animals, I think that there has to be more of a conversation because I do believe that animals should have some say over their lives and be able to say, "Hey, I'm not okay with that," and actually have it be listened to. And there needs to be more conversation rather than this belief that simply because they're animals, we have the right to force them to do whatever we want, regardless of how they feel. Because there's also that standpoint of if a horse is lame or they are starting to become lame and they have pain, if we never listen to them when they try to show in their behavior how they're feeling, we will make them more injured. So there needs to be this idea of conversation in the same way that you would in a healthy human relationship, and this isn't to anthropomorphize animals, but they can advocate for themselves if they are allowed to. They stop doing that when we teach them that it'll just get them punished more. But there needs to be this conversation because it's an incredibly toxic and abusive relationship if only one voice is ever heard and the other voice is not like any communication that isn't exactly what the other side of the relationship wants to hear is just written off. That's a toxic relationship.
Yeah, exactly. I love how you said too that it is similar with children again, and even just all the relationships. Like it makes me almost think about some people that are in narcissistic relationships with their spouse, like partners as well. Um, so I really feel like again, just this awareness of where is this coming from, and yeah, just that ability to have empathy and compassion for someone else and to put your feet in their shoes sort of thing. Um yeah, so really loved a lot of the things we talked about today. Um and yeah, your book just like the beginning of your book definitely I was really enjoyed reading and really like struck a lot of chords in my heart for sure. And just how honest you are with sharing your own story, and about how like you changed throughout the years, and really just to emphasize that growth that people have and that people can change if they choose to. Um, yeah, I really loved lots of the things we talked about today, and thank you so much. Do you mind maybe telling us a little bit about where people can find your book?
For sure. So you can get it anywhere you can buy books, basically. You can order it on Amazon, or if you'd prefer to support independent booksellers, you can buy it from independent booksellers that are in your country. I have a bunch listed on my website, milestoneequestrian.ca, under the publications tab. And it's not all of the available booksellers, so you can get it elsewhere as well. It's also available as an audiobook and an ebook. So if you prefer not having a physical book copy, you also have those options as well. Um, and yeah, you can order it basically anywhere. It's available in the US and Canada and like officially published in both those countries now. And then in Europe, it'll be published officially May 28th, but you can still pre order it now. And if you want to get it as early as possible, I would suggest doing that because it will ship sometimes they ship early, like, I know a bunch of the Americans that had pre-ordered got it, like, 2 weeks early before the actual publish date, so that's one of your best ways to try to get it early if you want, and, yeah, you can order it pretty much anywhere.
Awesome. Yeah. So Secrets of the Horse. Also, yeah, as you mentioned, you do some online consultation works for people that are further away. I know you hold in-person clinics. You travel quite extensively if there is,
Yeah.
people to make a clinic go. Yeah, so I'll put all those things in my show notes, how people contact you if they wish.
Perfect.
Yeah,
Thank
I
you
really
so
love
much.
this conversation. Yeah, thanks for your time.
Yeah, I did too. Thank you for having me.
And yeah, to your listeners, thanks for listening and catch you next time.